Thank you. Good morning, everyone. It's great to be here in Budapest. So I want to talk to you a little bit about how journalism at the New York Times has changed and how the New York Times has changed. And I also want to leave plenty of time for feedback and Q&A, and I'm really happy to talk about anything about the Times, whether it's stuff that I cover in the presentation or whether it's stuff that I don't cover in the presentation. I'm happy to talk about any of it. So I'm going to make sure I leave a nice, healthy amount of time for that kind of interaction, which is always my favorite part of coming to conferences like this one. So my background is a little funny. When I was growing up, there were always two things that I particularly liked. I loved information. I loved knowing what was going on in the world, which I later came to describe as journalism. But I liked it from when I was a really little kid, and all I cared about was sports and rushing to open the newspaper every morning and see what my favorite team, the Boston Red Sox, actually had done the previous night. And the second thing I loved was numbers. I loved math. Or at least I loved math for as long as it involved numbers. At a certain point, you get high enough in math, and there aren't any numbers anymore. That's where I jumped off of math. And I, for a while, thought that I had to choose between these two areas. And I ultimately came to realize that actually I didn't. And that while journalists, like a lot of people, make jokes about how they don't understand math and don't like math, there's actually a way in which math has become a much more important and much more central part of journalism than it used to be. And that's quite exciting for journalism, and more importantly, I would argue, it's quite exciting for readers. As those of you who are here from the States know, and probably many of you who are not know, we are on the cusp of a big election in the United States. And it just so happens that political coverage might be the single best example of the way that data has changed journalism. And just to be clear, I don't think journalism matters for its own sake. I think it matters because it's the information by which societies are able to function and citizens are able to stay informed. So I want to start off today by giving you a little bit of a case study for how journalism how the coverage of political events has changed, because I think it's a really nice sense for how data has changed journalism. I think this is not working. You guys want to? So I want to start by showing you the old way that elections used to be covered. In the United States, as in many countries, election returns do not all come in at the same time. They come in at different times for different parts of a region. So in a national election, the rural areas may come in before the urban areas, the same thing in US elections. So let's watch this video.
About to be closed in two key states that the Democrats desperately want. That would be Georgia and Kentucky. Stand by. And we have a major projection right now. CNN projects Mitch McConnell, the Republican leader in the United States Senate, will be reelected for another 6-year term, defeating Allison Lundergan Grimes. We make this projection not only based on the real votes that have already come in. You see he's up 55% to 42%. Also on exit poll results. This is a surprise. We were expecting.
Okay, great. Thank you. So what you see here is, the way they tend to report results is they tell you just the data that has come in. And that can be highly misleading data, because as I said, rural areas and urban areas may come in at different points, and as is the case in most countries, including Hungary, including the United States, rural and urban areas vote very differently. So we had, in 2014, which was the last midterm election, very similar to the election we'll have this year, when the president is not running, but lots of members of Congress are, we had a very close race in Virginia. And what happened over the course of the night in the United States was the way elections have been covered for decades and decades and decades, which is that journalists presented the data as the live vote totals came in. So one of the candidates was named Mark Warner, the other candidate was named Ed Gillespie, and they would say to you, so far Mark Warner has 50,000 votes and Ed Gillespie has 52,000 votes. The problem with this is that vote totals are not reported randomly. As you can see in this map, the big blue areas, which are for the Democratic Party in Virginia, are where the cities tend to be and the universities tend to be, and it's where Democrats get their votes. In Virginia, The rural areas report much, much sooner than the urban areas. They tend to be small communities, it's faster to count the votes, and so what ends up happening is every year in Virginia, the Republican is ahead early in the night. Every year. In 2008, Barack Obama won a landslide victory, but for most of the night, if you turned on the TV for election analysis, what you would have heard is John McCain is leading Barack Obama. And so relatively uninformed viewers sort of just didn't know what to make of this. Relatively informed viewers would sit there and say, yeah, but where are these votes coming from, and how much does it matter? What the New York Times has done for the first time of any major media organization is that it has created a regionally, geographically adjusted vote total that tells you where the votes are coming in. So the red line that you see here is the raw vote total. Look down at the bottom, you can see the red line, right? Right there. This is the raw vote total. And you can see early in the night, there is a huge Republican lead. The Republican, when votes first started getting counted, was up by 20 points. That's 60 to 40. So those TV broadcasts would have said, Ed Gillespie, the Republican, is up by 20 votes. Slowly over the course of the night, what happened is that his lead fell. But that was entirely expected. We should not have been surprised that his lead was going to fall because the early votes were coming in from places that were strongly Republican. In fact, even early on, once you adjusted for the geography, which is what this dotted line is, you should have known that this, first of all, that this was going to be an extremely close race, and second of all, that the Democrat, not the Republican, was actually ahead. So I want to show this to you once more. So this is how people actually experienced it over the course of the night. This video has crunched about 7 or 8 hours worth of time, and so what you're seeing is what viewers saw. So all through this period, at 8 p.m., at 9 p.m., at 10 p.m., the raw vote totals, what people were watching on television, were saying the Republican is ahead. But an adjusted vote total would have told you that the Democrats were ahead. This is a tweet from Kevin Quayle, one of the people who created this, which I love. So this is, he attributed dialogue to the two lines. So the red line is saying to the blue line, what do you think you're doing? Why aren't you saying the Republican's going to win? And the blue line saying back to the red line, oh, don't worry, you'll be where I am now. And sure enough, the two came together. This may seem like a relatively technocratic change, but my colleagues who created this have created a set of journalism that has become the single thing to watch in the United States. Roy Moore, an extremely conservative, very religious Republican candidate in Alabama, most famous for being the subject of multiple credible allegations of sexual molestation in Alabama, ran a Senate campaign there. You might guess that Roy Moore is not a huge fan of the New York Times. What did they have up at Roy Moore's headquarters? They had up these New York Times election coverage because people have come to understand that this is the right way to follow the election. So far, no one's yet copied the Times in doing this, but I expect that others will because as you can see from the coverage, it's really led to a revolution in how people do it. So what the Times now does, and it's led to a lot of controversy, and I'm happy to talk about it when we get to the Q&A, is it creates a needle based on these geographically adjusted totals. And it'll say to you, based on the estimated margin, Doug Jones, the guy who happened to be running against Roy Moore, we think is ahead by 0.3 percentage points, which means there's a 51% chance that Doug Jones is going to win. The first time that the Times unveiled this needle happened to be the presidential election in 2016. And so it led to a lot of traumatic feelings among people who thought that Hillary Clinton was going to win. And as the votes actually started coming in relatively short order, it was clear that Trump was actually going to win the election. I pick this example because I think it's a really good example of what data journalism is. Often people talk about data journalism like it's some little nerdy corner of journalism. But data journalism is not just for big projects, and it's not just for reporters like me who happen to like math, because I'm very much in the minority among my journalist colleagues. Data journalism can actually reinvent news coverage. It can change the way we tell stories. It can make those stories clearer, easier for readers and viewers to understand, and by making the stories clearer, it can make them more impactful. There are obviously a lot of challenges facing journalism today. First among them is our old business model, which revolved around advertising, is disappearing. Second among them is the widespread mistrust in many countries toward information that doesn't support people's prior beliefs. And I would say the third great challenge for journalism is the fact that some governments around the world are hostile to the free flow of information. These challenges are real. I don't want to minimize them. I just want to say that as real as these challenges are, there are also real strengths. There are ways that journalism has improved. And I think it's important that we not miss the strengths in the face of the weaknesses. When you put it all together, I would argue that journalism in 2018, at least in the United States, the country that I know best, is actually stronger than it was in 2010 or 2000 or 1990, or for that matter, 1950 or 1960, a period that gets a lot of nostalgia in the United States. It's better for readers, which is the most important thing of all. One of the big reasons to feel good about journalism involves the tools and techniques we have for telling stories. I joined the New York Times as a reporter in 1999, literally a different century. And since 1999, many of the basics of reporting and writing and editing stories, which remains the core of what the New York Times does, has remained largely unchanged. But nearly every other part of the process has changed radically. So when I joined the Times in 1999, the stories that I would do on a trend or an academic study would have likely been accompanied by 1 or 2 photos and a little black and white map. And if you looked really closely at that black and white map, you could have maybe discovered that California was a slightly different shade of gray than neighboring Oregon, which meant that some measure of social well-being in one of those states was slightly better or slightly worse than it was in the other of those states. I'm now going to show you a map from 1896, not when I joined the Times, but a century before. This is presidential results in 1896. And yes, this is a cartoonish map before we had the software to build maps, but the fact is, this map is actually more similar to the maps that we made when I joined the Times more than 100 years later than the maps of 1999 are similar to today. This is what we do now. This is an interactive that gives you a good sense for how much journalism has changed. This is a story about the odds of escaping poverty based on different counties that people grow up in. Gone is the little black and white map that just distinguished between states. In its place is a map that uses an IP address to figure out where our readers are and lets them see data about the area where they live. If the IP address gets that guess wrong, or if they want to look out where they're from, they simply enter it right at the top and can see it. By any definition, this is better journalism than the similar stories I was writing back in 1999. These tools have improved the quality of journalism that's being done from Antarctica to the Philippines, from the opioid epidemic to electoral politics, as well as in culture and food and sports. This is interactive done on a mass shooting, which, as we learned tragically again this week, something that happens a lot in the New York Times. The point here is that it's not just the mass shootings that lead to an enormous amount of death and injury in the US, it's the many, many number of shootings that involve 1 or 2 deaths. We tend to lose sight of that. My favorite stories in this new kind of story are the ones that literally could not have been done before. So this is an interactive that my colleagues created where you put in your hometown and your birth year and you see how much hotter your hometown is going to become. This kind of journalism would not have been possible before. We would have had to pick a single city, a single age. We couldn't have given anywhere near the richness of display. So we're going to do Budapest. We're going to pick someone younger than me, born in 1992, and we're going to see what this person could expect in terms of hot days when they were born, relative to now, relative to when they're much older. To do something a little bit more fun, a little bit less important, For sports fans, one of the big things that happens at the end of every season is you have to figure out whether your team's going to make the playoffs. If you're from Britain, you figure out which teams are going to get relegated and which are going to make the Champions League. This is another example of something that really wasn't possible in the print age. And what Kevin Qualey, the person whose tweet I showed you earlier, has done is he's created a database where readers can go in and they can select the outcome of every single football game for the rest of the season and see how that changes the odds of a team making the playoffs. It is completely addictive if you are a football fan. You get to go through and imagine all of your worst case scenarios in which your team loses all of its games. Green means that's an outcome that's going to increase the odds that your team will make the playoffs. Pink means it's an outcome that will decrease the odds. American football is famous for having particularly complicated playoff scenarios. Sometimes, though, it isn't the tools and it isn't the sophistication of the design that can actually have an impact. This is a project that I've been involved in over the past 5 years or so. I think it's the piece of journalism I've done that has had the clearest impact. As you can see, there aren't any fancy maps, there aren't any fancy videos here. All we did was we put every college that has a certain graduation rate on a screen, and we told you what percentage of their kids come from lower income families. The fact is, many elite colleges in the United States are shockingly homogenous when it comes to economics. They've diversified in all kinds of ways. They are much more likely to have women than they used to, much more likely to have people without white skin, much more likely to have people who are not Protestant, much more likely to have people who are not American. But one way in which they have not diversified very much at all is, from all of those groups, the students tend to be relatively affluent. And the colleges have essentially exaggerated how diverse they really are. They are diverse in obvious ways, not so diverse in less obvious ways. And what we did is we published the numbers that showed what percentage of kids come from the lower part of the economic spectrum. A few colleges look really great on this, particularly the University of California, which is the best example of a college in the US that is both elite and diverse. Many of the colleges are shockingly undiverse. It's not just private colleges like the University of Chicago or Dartmouth. It's also some public colleges like the University of Virginia, where you have more kids coming from families that make more than $200,000 a year than you do coming from families in the entire bottom half of the economic spectrum. Colleges don't like to be embarrassed in this way. They think of themselves as diverse. And so the mere publishing of this data has caused some, not nearly enough I would argue, but has caused some to begin to diversify their student body. It's a simple example in which when you put data in front of people, it can really change how they think about something. And while the presentation is simple, I would argue that the ability of people to manipulate the data themselves increases their trust in it and increases the impact that it can have. So far, I've focused on the ways that the data that journalists can use, but there's actually another really important form of data that has changed journalism, which is the data that journalists themselves get. On the screen now, you see an excerpt of a story that appeared in the Washington Post in the summer of 1994. It's a story about the behind-the-scenes political efforts to build a new sports arena in downtown Washington, an arena that is known today as the Capital One Arena. It's where the Washington Wizards play NBA basketball and the Washington Capitals play NHL hockey. If you look closely, you may be able to tell that I wrote this story. I was a summer intern at the Washington Post. I wrote it near the end of my internship, and I will confess that I felt pretty good about it. I thought I had taught readers something, and the editors stripped the story across the top of the Metro section, which back before the internet was the only way for editors to give a story higher profile. I was very pleased about this story. But there is a big problem with this story. I don't necessarily expect all of you to see it on the screen now, but if there is a particularly eagle-eyed member of the audience, you actually can see my big mistake. The problem is that there is a misspelled word in this story, and it is not just any word. It is Catherine, as in Katharine Graham, as in Katharine Graham, the longtime publisher of the Washington Post, the newspaper in which this article appeared. Catherine should have 2 A's and 1 E, not vice versa. I learned about this mistake about a week later when a small item appeared in a local alternative weekly called the Washington City Paper. I'm now going to read you the quote from the Washington City Paper. "There is a special place in the dungeon of the Washington Post for David Leonhardt," which is not exactly what you want to read when you're a summer intern trying to get hired into a full-time job. Coincidentally or not, I did not get hired into a full-time job at the Washington Post. Let's step back and think about what would happen if this same incident had happened today. think about how differently the situation would play out. The story would go online before it ever appeared in print, within minutes, and certainly within hours, some reader would begin mocking the story, probably on Twitter. In all likelihood, the mistake never would have made it into print and would have been fixed before the vast majority of readers of the story ever saw it. In the larger picture, spelling mistakes are not that important. They're mostly embarrassing. 25 years later, I'm apparently not over this spelling mistake. But this particular spelling mistake does highlight, I think, a larger point about the newly liquid market for truth and information and debate. In the old days, when people wanted to question the conclusions or the facts of a story, they didn't have a lot of good options. They had to write a letter to the editor, which might or might not get published, or they had to find another newspaper or magazine willing to write a different story. There's a reason for the old saying, don't get in a fight with someone who owns a printing press. Today, on the other hand, writers and readers are able to hash out big questions in real time. Not only does this newly liquid market help readers, it makes us journalists, better at our jobs. The Nobel laureate psychologist Daniel Kahneman has written, acquisition of skills requires a regular environment, an adequate opportunity to practice, and rapid and unequivocal feedback about the correctness of thoughts and actions. Let me read that again. Acquisition of skills requires a regular environment, an adequate opportunity to practice, and a rapid and unequivocal feedback about the correctness and thoughts and actions. With the exception of the word unequivocal, a big exception, I would argue that this entire description applies to journalism and social media today. It didn't used to, but I think it now does. I fully understand that this new reality comes with a downside. People can also promulgate falsehoods more easily than they could have in the past. We've seen some of those downsides over the past few years, and we're still figuring out how to combat them. They are a serious threat in many circumstances to good democratic functioning. I've been encouraged to see that Facebook and Google and others have started to take their own roles as information gateways more seriously and to make bigger efforts to distinguish between fiction and truth, but I don't think they've done enough, and there's much more to do here. Even with those downsides, though, I will take today's reality, in which more people are empowered to play a role in the flow of information, over yesterday's reality. I think today's is far more consistent with small d democratic values. So today's journalism has more and better data for journalists. It also has more and better data journalism for readers. And this is the best news of all. Readers are responding. Readers are telling us this isn't just a theory that one math-happy journalist happens to have. A huge portion of the most read, most engaged with journalism that the New York Times and other places do happen to involve these new forms of presentation and even happen to involve data journalism. These are the most read New York stories of 2017, and look at the list. So you've got huge news, right? You've got a big sporting event where we do a live blog, but look at 2 and 4. It's those scoreboards I showed you before. 2 of the 4 most read stories in the New York Times in 2017 were those election scoreboards that I just showed you. And it's not just there. It's a map tracking a hurricane's path, the kind of thing that wouldn't have been possible before. It's more election results. It's all kinds of ambitious journalism that takes a form that is different than we used to do. This is particularly important because it means we're not just doing this for ourselves and we're not just doing this for experts, but large numbers of people want to interact with large amounts of data when it's presented in ways they can understand. So what now? The good news is that for all the talk of journalism's trouble, the number of people who read a typical story at the New York Times has probably grown by between 50 to 100% since I joined the paper. A story that I would have written back then versus a story now, you hold everything else constant, there are probably twice as many people reading today's story. And they're not just reading it for free. A huge portion of Times readers are now paying. This graph has not been updated, but this shows that our consumer revenue has outstripped our advertising revenue. These two lines have continued in the same direction. There are now more than 2 million people around the world paying for digital-only access to the New York Times. I'm part of the sandwich generation of journalists. Young journalists think of me as old, and appropriately so. When I started working for newspapers in high school and college, my classmates and I put together our newspapers in much the same way that journalists had for decades and decades. We pasted columns of text onto a board. We used a printing press plate. We got our hands dirty. I can still remember the smell of the ink. It was great. It summoned an earlier time. At the same time, older journalists think of my generation as young, as being on the other side of the divide from them, and they're not wrong either. I got my first full-time job as a journalist, not at the Washington Post, as I've told you, but in 1995, which is the year Netscape Navigator was released. My entire career has occurred during the digital revolution. My peers and I have always understood that our business was in the process of rapid, major change, and we had to react in order to remain relevant. My sandwich status is part of the reason that Dean Baquet, the executive editor of the Times, asked me a year and a half ago to lead a strategic review of the Times operations. Our team consisted of stellar people from around the Times, from whom I learned an enormous amount. It was a fascinating and energizing experience. I just want to spend a couple minutes describing it before we go to Q&A. We called our review the 2020 Project because it was meant to point the way to the New York Times of the year 2020. And we came up with a basic diagnosis. The Times has changed enormously over the past decade, and as a result is in a stronger position than virtually any of our competitors, yet we have not changed nearly enough. We still have a newsroom and a news report that does not take sufficient advantage of the new tools available today. Our work too often reflects conventions built up over many decades, when we spoke to our readers once a day, when we cultivated an aura of detachment from them, and when almost our only tool was the written word, as opposed to also having interactive maps and graphics and video and podcasts and so much more. Fortunately, the size of the Times' audience, of our paying audience, gives us an opportunity to make the changes that we need to make. And the Times is now doing so under Dean's leadership. The graphics staff is growing. When I started working on graphics, the reporters were treated as the most important people in the room. The graphics editors were treated as people who were doing something to support the reporters. Over time, what I realized was that if we published one story, my text as a URL, and the graphics as a URL, the graphics URL would tend to get maybe 10 or 20x the readers of my text-only story. And so that in a very real way, the most important thing I was doing was supporting those graphics editors by writing text that would accompany their graphics. That's part of the reason why our graphics staff has grown. Our audio staff has grown. Many of you may know the Times podcast, The Daily, which has become a big hit. We've got other podcasts, including Still Processing. I've just started a podcast called The Argument with colleagues of mine on the opinion side. It's one of the only podcasts out there that talks about politics with people from across the political spectrum, people who regularly disagree. I think these kind of changes are vital. I think they're vital for producing good journalism. I also think they're vital for the Times' business model. If we don't do it, other people will, and they will displace us. But for all the ways that the Times, and not just the Times, the Washington Post and other top journalism properties in the US and around the world have changed, I want to end by pointing out that the fundamental mission and values of these places is actually remarkably consistent. For all that the Times has changed over the years, and this is an incredibly brief summary of the New York Times over the last century. That's the last black and white front page of the New York Times and the first color front page of the New York Times. The switch to color was one of the most controversial things the Times ever did. Arthur Sulzberger, the recently retired publisher, said he never got more angry mail than he did about this. Readers who said you were fundamentally undermining what the New York Times is by switching to color photographs. For all the changes that we have made over the years, I would argue that the fundamental mission is unchanged through all of this. It is to do our best, and we always do it imperfectly, it is to do our best to tell people about what's going on in the world and to use the tools at our disposal to help them understand the world that is around them. And whether that is through a black and white newspaper, a color newspaper, or all of these new digital products, that mission is unchanged, and it's why I think you can draw a relatively straight line from the New York Times of a century ago to the New York Times of 20 years ago to the New York Times of today. The extent to which we use data, both behind the scenes and in front of the readers, has changed enormously. The basic mission has not. Thank you all for having me to Crunch, and I am really looking forward to hearing your thoughts and criticisms and questions and comments.
Thank you, David. Great speech. Great talk. I forgot to mention this before, but you guys can visit to slido.com/crunchconf, or when you go to slido.com, you can enter in crunchconf, and there is the platform we're using to submit Q&A. And we already have a fair amount of questions up, so
good.
They'll be up on the screen, I believe. Do you want to? Can we have it on the screen? Sorry. Do you want it? Are we putting it on the screen or not? Yeah, we can start with it just here.
Great.
Data Boy has a question that says, "What tools, workflows do you use in your work?" If you'd like to answer.
What tools do I use in my work?
Yeah, what tool do you use?
So we use Slack a lot, not surprisingly. We still use email a lot. And we use, I would say the three biggest are Slack, email, and I don't know if this counts as a tool, but in-person meetings. In-person meetings remain, I actually think I think they are vital and important, and I think we slightly overuse them. There was I'm forgetting the name of it, there was a Showtime series on the New York Times, a 4-part Showtime series. First Draft, what was it called? In any event, it's easy enough to find on Google. And one of the things that people said to me when they watched it was, wow, you guys have a lot of people sitting in meetings, which I think is true. But those are the main tools.
Well, I totally agree with meetings in person. Very important. Thank you, Data Boy. Great name. Steven has a question that says, where do you get your data? If you use third-party data sets, who do you validate that data, or how do you?
So we do have to use a lot of third-party data. I mean, what I actually think there's a version of, and I'm sure there are real academics here. I understand why real academics will laugh a little bit at this, but there is a version of peer review that I think journalists should engage in. So we are often publishing data that has not gone through actual peer review, because the cycles of academia are such that by the time it has gone through peer review, it may not be relevant to what's going on in people's lives. So we have to figure out the balance. If we're not going to use only data that's gone through peer review, how do we make sure the data we're using is actually solid, or solid enough to use and then caveat in the right ways? And so what we will often do is, if we're using the data of one academic, or if we're putting together our own data, we'll essentially go around and share it with other academics and other researchers, and we'll say, hey, kick the tires for us on this. Tell us what you think is right and wrong about this, so that essentially so that there are no surprises. So, for example, that data that I showed you on college diversity, that's based on a statistic called Pell Grants. Before we published it, I had heard the case against using that data. It is a binary data set, right? So you are either a Pell Grant recipient, which means you come from roughly the bottom 40% of the economic spectrum in the US, or you are not. There is no spectrum on it. So the Pell Grant data would treat the child of Bill Gates as no different from the child who had just enough money to not qualify for a Pell Grant. And before we published it, I heard a lot of people who basically made the argument to me, here is how Pell data is flawed. But I got comfortable enough with the idea, it is the only data set that colleges publish that allow for an apples-to-apples comparison of their economic diversity. And so I'd heard the arguments against using it beforehand, and I was then comfortable enough with using it. Part of the reason I was comfortable enough with using it is, who do you think controls what data is released to the public about colleges? The colleges do themselves. So they do this sort of bait and switch where they release only a tiny bit of data, and then they say, that data is imperfect. You can't measure us based on that. Having heard those arguments beforehand, I then felt comfortable going back to people and saying, yes, it's imperfect. Most things are imperfect, but it is far better than nothing. And if you guys want to move us toward a world where we have better data, release better data. I don't have the power to do that. You do.
Nice. I agree. Anonymous says, does the fact that old business models are not working today lead to lower quality of journalism, e.g. clickbait articles?
So I don't know, well, we don't have to go back, but if in my Prezi, when I put up the ranking of the most read articles of 2017, I focused on how many of them were not simply straight text. But I could have focused on something else, which is just how serious the subjects on those articles were. Those were not articles mostly about real estate or diet or sex or one of the other great clickbait subjects. Those were articles about politics, tragedy, natural disaster. In some cases, they were very long articles that appeared in our magazine. So it is certainly the case that publications that are essentially trying to maximize their clicks and sell advertising will be tempted to move toward just clickbait subjects. But I would argue it was ever thus. For much of history in both Europe and the United States, we've had tabloid journalism. The internet did not invent tabloid journalism. People tried to build large circulation papers by writing big headlines. The most famous tabloid headline in the United States is "Headless Body Found in Topless Bar." Right? That is a version of clickbait journalism before the internet existed. That's from, I believe, the 1980s. It might be the 1970s. So that has always existed in the market for journalism and information. I think the good news is that there is also a subset of media properties that are trying and succeeding with a different model, and that's the subscriber-based model. When you go to someone and you say, and this was part of the 2020 report I mentioned, hey, we want to create a value proposition for you. You give us your money as a subscriber, and we will, in return, give you information worth paying for. And if we don't live up to that end of the bargain, you'll stop paying. And if we do, you'll keep paying, and we'll be able to afford journalists that we send to Iraq and Afghanistan and Asia, journalists to spend months combing through President Trump's business history to try to uncover the fraud that he committed before he was president. And in that model, it's actually not the modern version of headless body found in topless bar that readers want. They don't just want clickbait. They want something that they find of value. And so I do think there are clearly some tensions around the clickbait model. I don't think they're totally new. I think in some ways they're worse. But I think there are also a whole bunch of publications that are realizing that actually one of the ways to attract an engaged and often paying audience is not through clickbait subjects.
And so the next one, by Chris. Data can no doubt be the antidote to bias and fake news. Groan, that word. Does this pose new ethical obligations towards us vis-a-vis the democratic process that we might not have had the time to even contemplate, never mind grow up to? That is a mouthful, but people like it.
So one of the things that I've tried to emphasize in a bunch of different ways is some of the things that we think of as wholly new are not wholly new, right? It's the point of headless body, topless bar. And I think another example of that is partisan media. There is a lot of hand-wringing in the United States about information bubbles. It's not just in the United States, and how partisan parts of our information has become. That's actually the norm throughout most of history. Those of you who are European will be less surprised by this, right? You have in France and in England and in other countries, I assume in Hungary, you have papers that are considered right-leaning and left-leaning, right? You have Le Figaro and Le Monde. You have The Guardian and The Times in England. In the United States, there are still papers that have Republican or Democrat in their name. If you read about the history of the United States around its founding, it was not a bunch of people running around as, quote, objective journalists. It was people writing anonymous, often very partisan pieces, very ideological pieces, and ideological and partisan are not the same. I'm actually much more comfortable with ideological journalism than partisan journalism. It's only since World War II, for a variety of reasons, that the US has moved more toward this model of the unbiased, objective observer. And so if the internet pushes us back to a world where people are instead saying, oh, I understand where that argument is coming from, I will incorporate that into how I think about it, I think in many ways that's perfectly fine. What I do worry about is whether it's through social media or whether it's through state-controlled or state-owned media properties, or whether it's through private media properties like Fox News that effectively act as partisan state-allied media. I do worry that the sheer spread of that information through digital properties has taken this old phenomenon and turbocharged it or hypercharged it in ways that can be dangerous. And that's why I think that platforms like Google and Facebook have to think about their civic role in all of this. For all of human history, people who spread information, the best ones, have thought about their civic role. They've thought about their societal role, not just the profit and the loss that they may be making. And I think we have to also have that in terms of the digital spread of information.
Anonymous asks, how big is your data team and what roles do they have?
So I've been in management roles, as I talked a little about. I'm now not in a management role, I'm in a writing role. So I don't have a personal data team, but there are multiple data teams at the Times. There is a business side data team, which I actually, traditionally in newspapers, there's a sort of a divide between the business side and the journalism side. I don't know how large the business side data team is. Within the journalism, within the newsroom of the New York Times, there are a few different areas that really focus heavily on data. The most important is the graphics staff. It's a team of enormously competent, smart people. I'm biased, but I think it's by far the best data visualization of any major media property in at least the English language world. I'm biased because I work at the New York Times, but I've also had insight into how they work. They've repeatedly made my work look much better than I ever could have done on my own. They're a phenomenal team. They've got people with masters and with PhDs in data. They're also a very creative team. That team has several dozen people. And then there are smaller teams. The Upshot, which produces those election scoreboards, which I was involved in the founding of, has about 15 people. I would, I guess, argue that the data teams at the New York Times are vital and bigger than they used to be, and almost certainly not as big as they should be.
Going along with that, what kind of data visualization tools do your data teams use?
You know, I'm actually, in part because of what I just mentioned, I'm not the best person to answer that question because I'm usually not the one producing it on the back end. I will tell you, and if you, there was a presentation given at a conference by a former colleague of mine named Gregor Aisch, A-I-S-C-H. He created an incredible tool for the founding of the Upshot called Chartmaker. And what this did, it may seem simple to the rest of the world, but it was revolutionary within journalism, is it let print journalists and reporters and editors create their own charts. And so it really empowered print journalists, rather than always having to go to someone saying, can you make me a chart? Basically, it empowered them to make their own charts and helped them realize how hard that can be. It also made them grapple with the actual costs of producing charts. Rather than just walking to someone else and saying, hey, can you make this chart for me? They had to think to themselves, well, wait a second. Is this a chart-based story or is it not? Do I want to spend 5 hours or 1 hour or 12 hours producing a chart? And got people away from the instinct that we had too often. When we first got these tools, our instinct was, let's do it all. Let's do a story and a video and 6 photos and a big chart. That's, of course, not the right way to do it. And so I think empowering people to produce their own work, but then also saying to them, you have to engage with the trade-offs. Which one of these is actually worth doing is something that has relevance far beyond journalism, and Chartmaker helped us do that.
We probably have time for 1 or 2 more questions. I'm interested in if you have an opinion on when printed newspapers will die.
Yeah.
What is your forecast?
So I still, for all of my digital evangelizing within and beyond the Times, I still actually love print newspapers as a technology. I think it's worth thinking of them as a technology rather than, the answer is not old and new. The answer is print journalism is one kind of technology, digital journalism is another. Digital journalism has massive advantages over print journalism. Essentially, the whole first 10 minutes of my talk were examples of how digital journalism is better. None of those things were really possible in anything like the form that we publish them in print journalism. But it's also important to think about the advantages that print journalism has over digital journalism. The load times are really fast. The battery life is really good. The serendipity, I think, is better. you stumble across articles that you wouldn't have realized. It's not that I'm reading an article about Afghanistan and so you show me an article about India and Pakistan. I'm reading an article about Afghanistan and it happens to be next to an article about the regional elections in Germany. And so I read that. And I end up actually being quite pleased about that. I also think print journalism can give you a brief sense of the world in a way that digital journalism certainly has the capability of doing, but hasn't yet figured out how to do. So the Wall Street Journal, one of our competitors, I actually think its print newspaper is a delightful little summary of the world that day. If I want to spend 10 minutes figuring out what happened yesterday, it's not going to have necessarily delightful, long pieces the way the Wall Street Journal used to, but if I want to spend 10 minutes figuring out what happened in the world yesterday, I've yet to see a digital product that is quite as good as the print Wall Street Journal. If I want to know what happened in baseball yesterday, not during the playoffs, but during the regular season, I still think there's nothing that compares to a single page of box scores. And so I think print has big advantages. I'm ducking the question. I'll now take the question head on. I think this is probably a demographic question as much as anything. I actually think print journalism will certainly be around. Well, I shouldn't say certainly. I would be very surprised if printed newspapers were gone within a decade. I do not expect them to be here in a quarter century. So I could be wrong about either of those. I think many print publications may move to something where you get it digitally every day, but you get a weekly print product, almost more like a magazine, a more luxury product, a high-end product. I will be sad personally when daily newspapers disappear because while I spend more time reading digital journalism, print still gives me something that I don't get yet from digital.
I totally agree. Let's keep serendipity alive in news. For probably the last question, we have 5 minutes left. You can pick from any of these, or we can go with how do you find topics for data journalism?
So I'll combine that with the last one from David, because in some ways they are very similar. I think that one of the most important and underrated qualities in journalism, and it's not just journalism, it's anyone who is trying to present information to a large body of people, is empathy. I think too often journalists and academics and others fail to spend enough time putting themselves in the situation of their audience, their readers, their viewers, their listeners, trying to strip away their knowledge, trying to say, yes, I know a ton about this because I've been covering Mideast politics, to pick an example, for 20 years, and so I'm really obsessed with this one little thing. But what about the majority of my audience? What about the majority of my readers, listeners, and viewers? What matters to them? When you do that, I think it ends up answering a lot of the questions about the forms that things should take. They should take forms that above all promote clarity and understanding. Far too often in journalism, we do not optimize for clarity. We end up presenting people with information, whether it's through text or whether it's through visualizations, that don't give them a fundamental understanding of what happened. My test for that is, after someone read or listened to or watched a piece, could they turn around and then explain the essence of it to someone who had not read that piece? And the answer far too often is no. And so in presenting information to people, I think the first thing to try to do is put yourself in the situation of your audience. That ends up answering a lot of questions about, should this be audio? Should it be a map? Should it be a video? Should it be something else? And then when it is, what should we emphasize? What is really important to me as the person who's learned about this, but actually doesn't need to be part of the story, because if it is, it'll just end up confusing people, and then I'll lose them from the main message. And then the second question was, how do we pick the topics for our data journalism? I actually think it's a version of that, which is why I combined these two. I think the way to pick topics for data journalism is to start by saying, what are the most important issues going on in society today? And then to say, of those most important ones, what are the ones that are not getting enough attention and that we can actually tell people something that they don't already know? And then once you've asked those two questions, where can we go get data about them? If you start with those first two, as opposed to what data happens to exist, you won't run the risk of falling in love with a data set that doesn't actually say anything interesting or important, or delightful about what's going on in the world. Sometimes you can start from the data and go to something delightful, but it makes much more sense to start with a problem and go on. And I'll end where I started, which is the reason why my colleagues were able to create and really reinvent election night coverage was they put themselves in the position of viewers watching these TV election returns and realizing this isn't telling me anything useful. I can tell you right now, when you sit down and watch election returns in Virginia, the Republican will be ahead early in the night. And when you sit down and watch election returns in Iowa, the Democrat will be ahead early in the night. I can tell you that right now. It's not interesting. It's just the order in which those two states happen to report their election returns. So if you put yourself in the position of the reader or the viewer and you imagine you're sitting there frustrated saying, yeah, I know the Democrat's ahead in Iowa. The Democrat's always ahead in Iowa at 9:30 in the East. Tell me something I actually need to know. You can then get to the point where you're creating something that is new and is useful and that readers actually want to read, and maybe even for the sake of journalism are willing to pay for. So thank you again.
Absolutely. We have some more time, or we can. Okay,
Oh,
we'll call
great.
it there. Thank you.
Yes, I'm set. Great.